You people always make everything difficult." Richard Caldwell said it loudly enough for every passenger in first class to hear. The words landed harder than the suitcase Danielle Brooks had just placed in the overhead bin. Conversation stopped. Ice shifted inside a glass. A flight attendant froze beside the galley curtain. Danielle stood in the aisle, one hand holding her boarding pass, the other resting calmly against the strap of her leather bag. Seat 2A was printed clearly beneath her name. Richard was sitting in it. He looked comfortable there, broad shoulders pressed into the cream-colored seat, silver watch catching the cabin light, as though the space had belonged to him long before she arrived. "That is my seat," Danielle said. Her voice was quiet, steady, and impossible to mistake. Richard glanced at her navy coat, her plain shoes, then at the boarding pass without taking it. "There must be an error." "There isn't." The flight attendant stepped closer. Her name tag read Emily Carter. She scanned Danielle's pass, then checked the screen mounted near the galley. "Mr. Caldwell, you're assigned to 3C." Richard did not move. He gave Emily a practiced smile, the kind designed to make resistance feel unreasonable. "I was told I'd been upgraded." "You were upgraded to 3C, sir." A few passengers lowered their eyes. Others watched openly. Danielle felt the familiar pressure gathering in the cabin, that silent expectation that she should solve everyone's discomfort by making herself smaller. She had learned long ago that anger looked different on a black woman. A raised voice became aggression. A firm answer became a threat. So she kept her shoulders relaxed and held out the evidence. "I paid for 2A. I would like to sit down." Richard's smile disappeared. "You can sit somewhere else for an hour." The flight was scheduled from Atlanta to Washington, nearly 2 hours in the air, but Danielle did not correct him. She looked past his shoulder toward the window. Rain traced thin silver lines across the glass. Beyond it, runway lights glowed beneath a low gray sky. Inside her bag was an encrypted drive containing test data that had kept her awake for 3 nights. She needed to deliver it before midnight. Hundreds of employees were waiting for what happened next, though no one in the cabin knew her name beyond the letters on her ticket. Richard reached for the coffee beside him. Some people don't understand how these things work. He lifted the cup as Danielle leaned slightly forward to show Emily the seat number again. His elbow moved. Coffee spilled across Danielle's sleeve, dark and hot, soaking into the fabric. Richard jerked back, then stared at her as if she had caused it. "She grabbed me," he said. Emily blinked. "Sir, she did not." Richard raised his voice. "I want security." Danielle looked at him, then at the spreading stain on her coat. The cabin had gone completely silent. Somewhere near the rear, a child whispered to her mother. Richard reached for the call button, his finger striking it twice. 5 minutes later, the entire flight would be stopped. But at that moment, everyone believed Danielle Brooks was the problem. Danielle did not look at Richard again. She pressed a folded napkin against the wet sleeve of her coat while Emily stood between them, her face tight with disbelief. The coffee had already cooled against Danielle's skin, but the humiliation burned hotter. Around them, first-class passengers pretended to study their phones, menus, and window shades. No one wanted to become part of the scene. No one wanted to admit they had seen exactly what happened. Danielle understood that silence. She had met it in hotel lobbies, executive dining rooms, and conference halls where people assumed she was an assistant until she took the seat at the head of the table. She had spent 15 years building Brooks Aeronautics from a rented office outside Detroit into one of the nation's most trusted aviation technology firms. That morning, however, she had chosen a plain coat, practical shoes, and no security detail. She had wanted one quiet flight to Washington. Instead, she stood in the aisle while a stranger explained her presence as a disruption. "Please remain calm," Emily said, though her eyes were directed at Richard. "Security is on the way, and we will review what happened." Richard leaned back in Danielle's seat as if the matter had already been settled. "There is nothing to review." She became confrontational. Danielle lowered the napkin. "I asked you to leave the seat printed on my boarding pass. You stepped into my space. Because you were sitting in mine." His jaw tightened. The simple answer had left him nowhere to hide, so he reached for status instead. He mentioned his frequent flyer level, his business connections, and a member of the airline's board whom he claimed to know personally. Each name was offered like a key that could unlock a different version of the truth. Danielle listened without reacting. Inside her bag, the encrypted drive rested beside a sealed technical report marked urgent. 3 nights earlier, her engineering team had identified an irregular signal in a new pressure sensor system. The flaw appeared only under a rare combination of temperature, altitude, and electrical load. It had not yet caused an accident, but Danielle had learned never to confuse luck with safety. She was flying to Washington to brief federal officials before the system could be installed on another aircraft. Her phone vibrated once. A message from Elena Torres appeared on the screen, preliminary comparison complete. Call when airborne. Danielle read it, locked the phone, and returned it to her pocket. She could not discuss the report in a crowded cabin. Not yet. Heavy footsteps sounded from the boarding bridge. 2 airport police officers entered the aircraft, their dark uniforms cutting through the warm cabin light. Richard sat straighter. Several passengers finally looked up. Danielle noticed how quickly relief moved across his face. He believed authority had arrived for him. The first officer, Mark Reynolds, scanned the cabin and stopped when Richard pointed toward Danielle. "That is her," Richard said. Reynolds did not ask who owned seat 2A. He did not look at the boarding pass in Danielle's hand. He looked at her coffee-stained coat, then at the composed white man sitting beside the window. In that brief silence, Danielle saw the decision being made before a single question was asked. Officer Reynolds stepped into the aisle with Officer Kevin Doyle behind him, both men carrying the quiet confidence of people accustomed to being obeyed. Reynolds looked first at Richard, then at Danielle, and the order mattered. "What happened here?" he asked. Richard answered before Emily could speak. "She tried to take my seat, got aggressive, and then made contact with me when I told her to calm down." His voice was smooth now, measured and wounded, stripped of the contempt he had shown only moments earlier. Danielle watched the performance settle over the cabin like a layer of smoke. Reynolds nodded once, as though the story already made sense. "Ma'am, I need you to step off the aircraft." Danielle held up her boarding pass. "Officer, this is my assigned seat." Reynolds glanced at the paper without taking it. "We can sort that out at the gate." "There is nothing to sort out," Emily said. "Seat 2A belongs to Ms. Brooks. Mr. Caldwell is assigned to 3C, and I witnessed the coffee spill. She did not touch him." Doyle looked toward Richard, but Reynolds kept his attention on Danielle. "Ma'am, I am asking you to cooperate." The word cooperate hung in the air with a familiar weight. Danielle had heard it used in meeting rooms when someone wanted obedience without questions, and in security offices when facts became inconvenient. She lowered the boarding pass but did not put it away. "Have you checked his ticket?" Reynolds exhaled through his nose. "We are not going to debate this in the aisle." "I am not debating. I am asking whether you checked the evidence." Richard shifted in the seat and folded his arms. "This is exactly what I meant. She will not let it go." A passenger across the aisle looked down at his watch. Someone behind Danielle whispered that the flight was already late. The pressure began to move toward her, not because she was wrong, but because everyone wanted the discomfort to end. Reynolds stepped closer. "You are disrupting the boarding process." Danielle looked at the closed overhead bin, the seated passengers, and the empty space where she should have been. The boarding process was disrupted when he refused to move. Emily raised her tablet. "Officer, I can show you the seat assignments." Reynolds did not reach for it. Instead, he looked at the coffee stain across Danielle's sleeve and then back at her face. "Did you raise your voice?" "No." "Did you approach him?" "I approached my seat." Richard gave a small, humorless laugh. "She came at me." Emily's expression hardened. "That is not true." Reynolds finally turned to her. "Ma'am, let us handle this." The dismissal was polite but complete. Danielle felt something inside her go still. Not fear. Not anger. Recognition. The facts were present. The witness was present. The ticket was present. Yet Reynolds had chosen the version that required the least challenge to the men already seated. Danielle slid one hand into her coat pocket and touched her phone. "Before I step off," she said, "I want the record to show that you are removing the passenger with the valid boarding pass." Reynolds' jaw tightened. "I am removing the person causing the problem." Danielle met his eyes. "No, officer. You are removing the person you decided was the problem before you looked at the facts." The cabin fell silent again. Even Richard stopped smiling. Then Reynolds extended one hand toward the exit. "Let us go." Danielle did not move immediately. Her phone vibrated once against her palm. Elena Torres had sent another message. The comparison was no longer preliminary. The words on the screen were brief, but they changed everything. "Flight 417 matches Delta 7. Danielle read the message twice, not because the words were unclear, but because their meaning reached far beyond the argument in the aisle. Delta 7 was the internal name of a sensor anomaly her engineers had been tracking for 72 hours. It appeared without warning, vanished under standard testing, and returned only when a specific electrical load met a narrow range of cabin pressure. The pattern was rare. It was also now present on Flight 417. Reynolds motioned toward the exit again. "Ma'am, move." Danielle lifted one finger, not in defiance, but as a request for a single second. "I need to make one call." "You can make it at the gate." "This call concerns the aircraft." Richard let out a dry laugh from seat 2A. Now she is an airplane expert. Several passengers smiled nervously, grateful for any excuse to make the moment feel smaller than it was. Danielle ignored them. She called Elena Torres. The line connected immediately. "Confirm the tail number," Danielle said. Elena's voice came through low and urgent. "November 714 Bravo Kilo. Same pressure drift, same timing gap, same secondary voltage fluctuation." Danielle looked toward Emily. "Is that this aircraft's registration?" Emily checked the data on her tablet. Her face changed. "Yes." Reynolds reached toward Danielle's phone. "End the call." Danielle stepped half a pace back, keeping her voice calm. "Elena, compare Flight 417 with Incident File Delta 7 and notify operations under Emergency Review Protocol." There was a brief pause. Keyboard taps sounded through the speaker. "Understood." The call had lasted 7 seconds. Danielle ended it herself and slipped the phone into her pocket. Reynolds stared at her. "What did you just do?" "I requested a technical comparison." "You are not authorized to interfere with this flight." Danielle held his gaze. "You have not asked who I am." Richard leaned into the aisle. "Because it does not matter who you are. You are delaying everyone." Danielle turned toward Emily. "Please document that I presented a valid boarding pass, that Mr. Caldwell refused his assigned seat, and that Officer Reynolds declined to review the seat records before ordering me off the aircraft." Emily nodded. "I will. Also document the time." Emily looked at the clock on her tablet. 8:43. Reynolds' patience thinned. "This is your final warning." "I am cooperating," Danielle said. "But cooperation does not require silence." Doyle shifted beside him. For the first time, he looked directly at Emily's screen, then at Richard's boarding pass resting near the armrest. "Mark," he said quietly, "maybe we should verify the assignments." Reynolds did not turn. "We are past that." The sentence settled heavily over the cabin. Danielle understood then that the officer was no longer protecting order. He was protecting his first decision. Richard had noticed it too. His confidence returned, polished and effortless. He lifted the untouched glass beside him and said, "Some people only understand authority." Danielle looked at the man occupying her seat, then at the officer blocking the aisle. Authority without evidence is only preference in a uniform. No one spoke. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Emily tightened her grip on the tablet. Somewhere beyond the cabin walls, Danielle knew Elena's alert was moving through the airline system, passing from one screen to another, climbing toward someone with the power to stop the aircraft. Reynolds pointed toward the boarding door. Danielle picked up her bag. She walked slowly, not defeated, not hurried, carrying the only information that could keep everyone on that plane safe. Danielle stepped onto the boarding bridge with Officer Reynolds close behind her and Officer Doyle several feet back, his expression no longer certain. The aircraft door remained open for a moment, framing the warm cabin behind them. Richard Caldwell sat in seat 2A with one arm resting along the window, his posture loose, victorious. He watched Danielle leave as though the aisle had finally been cleared of an inconvenience. Emily stood near the galley, still holding her tablet. Her eyes followed Danielle until the door began to close. Before it sealed, Danielle looked back once. Not at Richard. At Emily. The flight attendant gave the smallest nod. She had understood. The door shut with a heavy mechanical sound, cutting off the cabin and every witness inside it. The boarding bridge felt colder. Fluorescent light flattened the walls, and rainwater rattled faintly against the metal roof. Reynolds pointed toward the terminal. "Keep moving." Danielle adjusted the strap of her bag and walked. She did not rush. Her pulse was steady, but every detail around her felt sharp, the rubber soles against the floor, the hum of ventilation, the pressure of time moving forward without permission. "You should have listened when I asked you to cooperate," Reynolds said. Danielle kept her eyes ahead. "I did cooperate. You challenged every instruction. I asked you to check a boarding pass." Reynolds stopped near the end of the bridge. Danielle turned. Behind him, Doyle stood. Beside a narrow window overlooking the ramp. The aircraft lights glowed through the rain. "You made this harder than it had to be," Reynolds said. Danielle looked at him for a long second. "No. You made the truth inconvenient, then blamed me for not disappearing." Doyle lowered his gaze. Reynolds reached for his radio and told the gate agent that the issue had been resolved. The words were calm and official. Resolved. Danielle heard them and thought of Richard settling into her seat, of Emily's ignored testimony, of the message from Elena moving through the airline's technical network. Nothing had been resolved. Inside the aircraft, Richard accepted a fresh glass of sparkling water from another crew member and leaned toward the passenger beside him. "Some people think a ticket makes them important," he said. The men beside him gave an uncomfortable smile. Across the aisle, a woman pretended not to hear. 3 rows back, a young girl stared toward the closed cabin door, her small hands folded around a stuffed rabbit. She had watched everything. Emily moved through the cabin checking seat belts, but her attention kept returning to her tablet. She opened the service log and entered the time, the seat numbers, the names, and the officer's refusal to review the assignment records. Then she saved the security video to the protected incident folder. Richard noticed. "Are we finally leaving?" he asked. Emily looked at him. "The captain has the final decision. The problem is gone." Emily did not answer. Outside, the boarding bridge pulled away. Danielle stood behind the terminal glass with Reynolds beside her. The aircraft began to push back from the gate, its nose turning slowly toward the taxiway. A low vibration traveled through the floor. Richard raised his glass as the plane started moving. Then, in the operations center 2 levels below, 3 warning indicators turned red at the same time. In the operations center, Elena Torres leaned toward the monitor as 3 red indicators pulsed across the aircraft status screen. Pressure drift. Voltage fluctuation. Timing mismatch. The same sequence her team had seen in Delta 7, now unfolding in real time. Around her, rows of screens reflected pale blue light across tired faces, but Elena heard only the quiet beeping from Flight 417. "Run it again," she said. A technician repeated the comparison. The pattern returned unchanged. Elena reached for the direct operations line. "Hold Flight 417 immediately." On the taxiway, Captain Samuel Hayes heard the order through his headset just as the aircraft approached the next turn. He eased the plane to a stop. The engines continued their low, steady hum, but the forward motion ended so smoothly that several passengers barely noticed. Richard did. He looked toward the window, then at Emily. "Why have we stopped?" Emily pressed the interphone to her ear. Her expression tightened as the cockpit message came through. "We are returning to the gate for a technical review." A murmur moved through the cabin. Seat belts clicked. Phones appeared. Richard looked at his watch. "This is unbelievable. We removed the problem." Emily met his eyes. "The problem was never the passenger. Beyond the terminal glass, Danielle watched the aircraft pause beneath the rain. The white lights along its body remained still against the dark pavement. Reynolds stood beside her, speaking into his radio, unaware that the balance of the moment had already shifted. Doyle watched the plane more carefully. "Why is it stopping?" he asked. Danielle did not answer. She placed one hand against the cool glass. Rain traced narrow paths beneath her fingertips, turning runway lights into blurred streaks of red and gold. For 3 nights, she had studied numbers until they seemed to float behind her closed eyes. She remembered the first irregular reading, the way the pressure data had dropped for less than a second before correcting itself. Most systems would have dismissed it as noise. Danielle had not. Small warnings were often ignored because they did not arrive loudly. So were people. Her phone vibrated. Elena's message appeared: aircraft held. Operations notified. Executive authorization required. Danielle read it without triumph. There were more than 100 passengers on that plane, including Richard, Reynolds' preferred witness, and every silent person who had watched her removal. Their safety did not become less important because they had failed her. She opened the emergency authorization portal and entered her credentials. A confirmation code appeared. She approved the hold. Reynolds finally noticed the name displayed across the top of her screen: Danielle Brooks, Chief Executive Officer, Brooks Aeronautics. His face changed, but only slightly. "You work for the manufacturer?" he asked. Danielle locked the phone. "My company designed the backup monitoring system." Doyle turned fully toward her. "You are the Danielle Brooks." She looked through the glass as the aircraft began a slow turn back toward the terminal. "I am the woman whose boarding pass you did not check." The words were quiet. They needed no force. Reynolds' radio crackled with a new message from Airport Command, followed by another from Airline Operations. His posture stiffened. The gate agent rushed toward them, tablet in hand, breath short from running. "We need Dr. Brooks at the aircraft immediately." Danielle kept her eyes on the returning plane. Its landing lights moved through the rain like 2 steady stars. For the first time since she had entered the cabin, no one was asking her to step aside. The aircraft reached the gate beneath a wash of amber lights, its engines winding down into a deep mechanical hush. Inside the cabin, passengers leaned toward the windows as the boarding bridge moved into place. Richard sat rigidly in seat 2A, his glass untouched on the tray table. The confidence that had carried him through the earlier confrontation had begun to drain from his face. Emily stood near the front galley, listening as Captain Hayes spoke over the interphone. "Remain seated until further instruction." No one complained. The door opened, and the first person to step onto the aircraft was not a mechanic or a security officer. It was Danielle Brooks. She entered beside the airline's director of operations, with Elena Torres following close behind, a tablet held against her chest. Officer Reynolds and Officer Doyle remained at the gate entrance, no longer directing the scene. Every face in first class turned toward Danielle. She walked past the row where she had been dismissed only minutes earlier, the coffee stain still dark across her sleeve. Richard stared at her as though he were seeing an entirely different person, though nothing about her had changed. "Dr. Brooks," Captain Hayes said as he stepped from the cockpit, "we received the emergency hold. What are we looking at?" Danielle did not glance at Richard. She opened Elena's tablet and studied the live data. A pressure sensor drift linked to a secondary voltage fault. The system is correcting the readings before they reach the main display, which is why the cockpit did not receive a standard warning. Captain Hayes frowned. Could it affect altitude data? Under the wrong conditions, yes. The cabin became still. A woman across the aisle slowly lowered her phone. The child with the stuffed rabbit pressed closer to her mother. Elena enlarged 3 red lines on the screen. The sequence matches Delta 7 within 0.02 of a second. Captain Hayes looked at Danielle. "What do you recommend?" "Evacuate the aircraft calmly, disconnect ground power, and inspect the aft sensor relay before this plane moves again." There was no hesitation in her voice, only precision. Captain Hayes nodded and turned to Emily. "Begin a controlled deplaning." Richard finally stood. "This is absurd. We were already cleared to fly." Danielle looked at him for the first time since returning. You were cleared before the fault appeared. And you expect everyone to believe you stopped the flight from a phone call? The director of operations stepped forward. Ms. Brooks' company designed the backup monitoring architecture on this aircraft. She has final emergency review authority under our safety agreement. Richard's mouth opened, but no answer came. Reynolds heard every word from the doorway. His gaze dropped toward the floor. Danielle closed the tablet and handed it back to Elena. Safety does not care who is important, she said. It only cares who is paying attention. Emily began guiding passengers toward the exit. As they passed Danielle, several avoided her eyes. One man quietly thanked her. The little girl with the stuffed rabbit stopped beside her and whispered, "I knew you were telling the truth." Danielle smiled gently. So did the evidence. Richard remained beside seat 2A while the cabin emptied around him. For the first time, the seat no longer looked like something he had won. It looked like the place where everyone had watched him reveal exactly who he was. Richard was the last passenger to leave the aircraft. He stepped into the terminal without the confidence he had carried into seat 2A, his shoulders stiff beneath his tailored jacket. At the gate, the airline's director of operations stood beside Emily, Captain Hayes, and 2 members of Airport Command. A maintenance supervisor approached from the boarding bridge holding a sealed component bag. Inside it rested a scorched pressure relay no larger than a deck of cards. The aft unit failed under load, he said. Dr. Brooks was right. If the readings had continued drifting after takeoff, the crew could have received conflicting altitude data. A silence spread across the gate area. Passengers who had complained about the delay now looked toward Danielle with a different understanding. She had protected them without demanding gratitude, even after many of them had watched her be treated as though she did not belong. Richard glanced at the relay, then at Danielle. "I did not know who you were," he said. Danielle's expression remained calm. "You knew I had a valid ticket." His face tightened. "I thought there had been a mistake." Emily stepped forward with her tablet. "There was a mistake, Mr. Caldwell. It was yours." She opened the protected incident file. The video showed Richard refusing to move, spilling the coffee, and claiming Danielle had touched him. His own words played clearly through the small speaker. Reynolds watched from several feet away, his face pale beneath the terminal lights. Doyle stood beside him, arms lowered, no longer hiding behind procedure. The airport commander turned to Reynolds. "Did you review the boarding records?" Reynolds swallowed. "No, sir." "Did you interview the flight attendant before removing Ms. Brooks?" "She attempted to speak, but I believed immediate action was necessary." Danielle looked at him. "You believed him before you heard me?" Reynolds did not answer. The commander requested both officers' badges pending a formal review. Doyle handed his over first. Reynolds hesitated, then placed his badge into the commander's palm. The soft metallic sound seemed louder than anything else in the terminal. Richard looked toward the exit, but an airline security manager blocked his path. "You made a false report regarding another passenger," she said. "You will need to remain here while airport authorities review the incident." "This is unnecessary," Richard replied. "No," Emily said quietly. Ignoring the truth was unnecessary. The little girl with the stuffed rabbit stood nearby with her mother. She watched Danielle as if waiting to see what justice looked like when it finally arrived. The director of operations offered Danielle a private lounge, a replacement coat, and transportation to Washington. Danielle declined the lounge but accepted a clean jacket from Emily. "What do you want us to do next?" the director asked. Danielle looked around the gate at the passengers, the officers, and the men who had occupied her seat. "Preserve every record. Interview every witness. Then train your people to examine evidence before they protect privilege." Reynolds raised his eyes. "Dr. Brooks, I am sorry." Danielle held his gaze. She did not offer him quick forgiveness, and she did not humiliate him. An apology matters when it changes what you do next. Behind them, maintenance crews continued working inside the aircraft. Tools clicked softly. Rain tapped against the terminal windows. Justice had not arrived with shouting or revenge. It had arrived as evidence, responsibility, and the quiet removal of power from those who had used it carelessly. 2 hours later, the rain had softened to a silver mist against the terminal windows. Flight 417 remained at the gate, its damaged relay removed and its systems under inspection. The passengers had been rebooked, the incident record secured, and the airline had opened formal reviews into Richard's false report and the officer's conduct. Danielle stood near the window in Emily's clean navy jacket, watching maintenance crews move beneath the aircraft lights. Her coffee-stained coat rested inside a clear evidence bag. It seemed strange that something so ordinary could now represent the moment an entire room had chosen comfort over truth. The director of operations approached with a new boarding pass and a car voucher. "We can get you to Washington tonight," he said. "Your meeting has been delayed until you arrive." Danielle accepted the pass. "What about the passengers?" "Everyone has been reassigned. The airline will cover their expenses." He hesitated. "We are also changing our response policy. Seat records and witness statements will be reviewed before any passenger is removed." Danielle looked toward Reynolds, who sat in a quiet office across the concourse while Airport Command completed its report. Doyle was giving a statement nearby. Neither man wore a badge. "A policy only matters when people follow it under pressure," she said. "We will make sure they do," the director replied. Richard remained with airport authorities, no longer surrounded by the signs of status that had protected him earlier. His expensive watch, polished shoes, and confident voice could not erase the video. Before Danielle left the gate, he asked to speak with her. A security manager stood between them. Richard's eyes dropped briefly to the stain visible through the evidence bag. "I was wrong," he said. "I judged you before I knew anything about you." Danielle studied him in silence. "You knew enough," she replied. "You knew the seat was mine. You knew the flight attendant confirmed it. You simply believed your comfort mattered more than my rights." Richard had no answer. Danielle did not wait for one. She turned and walked toward her new gate. Emily caught up with her near the moving walkway. "I should have stopped them sooner," she said. Danielle looked at the young flight attendant whose testimony had finally exposed the truth. "You spoke when it mattered. It did not feel like enough. Courage rarely does while you are using it." Emily smiled, and for the first time that evening, Danielle did too. At the next gate, the little girl with the stuffed rabbit waved from beside her mother. Danielle lifted a hand in return. The child's mother quietly thanked her for protecting everyone, including the people who had remained silent. Danielle glanced through the glass at the long runway, now shining beneath a break in the clouds. She had not saved the aircraft by proving she was more powerful than Richard. She had saved it because she paid attention when others dismissed a warning. That was the lesson the night left behind. Dignity does not depend on a title, truth does not become weaker when ignored, and kindness is not surrender. Sometimes the strongest person in the room is the one who refuses to let injustice make them cruel. As Danielle boarded her new flight, morning light began to gather at the edge of the sky. Behind her, Seat 2A on Flight 417 remained empty, and the last bubbles in Richard's untouched glass had disappeared. What would you have done if you had been sitting in that cabin and knew the truth?